Welcome, everyone. Today is a day of somber news, but there are also bright spots around the world in terms of the state of budget transparency and accountability. We want to thank the World Bank, the International Budget Partnership, and Oxfam America for convening this very important discussion about where we are in the world. When we think about government, particularly national governments' budgets around the world, a good estimate is somewhere between $20 and $30 trillion of government budgets every year. The best we can know, because we don't have complete transparency, in fact. We want to know how transparent, participatory, and accountable those budget-making processes are, and the Open Budget Survey and Index is one of the key tools and measures by which we do that. We're going to begin today with a set of opening remarks from Jan Walliser, the Vice President of the Governance Unit at the World Bank. After that, Vivek Ram Kumar is going to provide some overview of the Open Budget Survey that was recently released. And then we're going to have a very important panel with three leading finance officials from key parts of the world and colleagues from the IMF, Oxfam, and from the independent sector. So without further ado, my name is Professor Sanjeev Kagram. I'm the John Park Young Professor of Global Political Economy at Occidental College. I also was the co-editor of Open Budgets, the Political Economy of Fiscal Transparency, Participation, and Accountability, an edited volume published by Brookings in 2013 on transparency and accountability of budgets around the world, and one of the founders and architects of the Global Initiative on Fiscal Transparency, which my good colleague and friend Juan Pablo Guerrero is now the executive director of. Without further ado, if I could have Jan come to the stage and welcome us with his opening remarks, please.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you this morning for joining us for this conference on the state of budget and accountability. I'm very pleased that we can host this event together with Oxfam America and with the International Budget Partnership. And I also, on behalf of President Kim, want to welcome our distinguished guests who have kindly come, some of them a long way, to participate in this conference to speak about the importance of open budgets and transparency in budgeting for development. We all know that engaging citizens and civil society in the budget process is absolutely critical because it benefits everyone and it helps governments know where public resources are needed the most. If we look at an example from Kenya, Kenya is facing wide disparities in opportunities and service delivery across the country, and the government is pushing to give communities, through a decentralization process, greater decision-making power over public resources. Translating these goals at the district level into meaningful action is no simple task, given the challenges of reaching citizens in remote regions and ensuring that the participation of all, in particular of women. The World Bank has helped pilot a participatory budgeting approach in Kenya, involving citizens in setting spending priorities in 2 rural counties in Kenya. Early results show that government spending is now better aligned with needs. Citizens are increasingly prioritizing maintenance and upgrades of facilities, as well as community-level investments such as wells for drinking water and women's development funds. The approach also sped up the budget approval process, boosted the inclusion of women. In one of the counties, the share of women participating in budget consultation has grown from 11% to 35%. And about 30% of the county's development budget is now allocated through participatory budgeting. I think this is a clear example that demonstrates how important it is to have transparency and participation to make better choices for citizens through the budgeting process. And while we have seen some governments actively working to share information with citizens and to create the mechanisms for the public to voice their preferences and opinions on budgets, the results of the International Budget Project's Open Budget Survey 2017 are concerning. The 2017 survey, and we will hear more of this in a moment, has documented a stall in what had been a steady increase in government budget transparency over the past decade. And it has found that across the globe, institutional practices for engaging the public in the budgeting process remain quite weak. So what do we need to do about this? And I emphasize that it's now about doing. I think it's not about the principle that open and transparent budgeting and participatory budgeting are beneficial for better results. The benefits of open budgeting are clear, and there are plenty of international good practices and standards that are widely available. So we need commitment and action to implement these. And we need to proactively implement and address the shortcomings in transparency and public participation. Ensuring that public funds are spent efficiently and with full accountability is instrumental to the World Bank Group's mission to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. And when we partner with governments, we want to know if the government makes information available to the public that details how they are raising spending public money are made available, and that there are strong oversight mechanisms afterwards to report on where public funds have been spent and whether they actually were spent where they were intended to be spent. And by the way, it should come as no surprise that one of the main sources our project teams look for when they look to help and assist governments in these issues is the Open Budget Survey. At the World Bank, we recognize growing citizen frustration with high levels of corruption and poor service delivery are important impediments to social cohesion and thereby to development. Indeed, governance challenges like these are increasing around the world, and governments are faced with increasingly constrained fiscal space and increasingly complex service delivery challenges, and this limits the ability to meet the needs and aspirations of their citizens, and as a consequence, citizens around the world, and we see that in other surveys, are having declining trust in government. The open government and transparent government, as well as participatory budgeting, are one of the ways in which one can combat the declining trust of citizens in government and create links between the way in which revenues are being raised and revenues are being spent in line with priorities of the citizenry, and therefore build the trust and continue to maintain the trust between government and its citizens. At the World Bank, we're committed to advancing open and accountable budgeting by calling on governments to share more information on their budgets and creating formalized mechanisms for public views to be incorporated in the budget process. And we stand ready to support our clients by, to give just one example, helping them to leverage the potentially game-changing power of data and technology to improve transparency, efficiency, and participation, and transform the way governments and citizens interact. We've seen this at work in Brazil, where participatory budgeting programs continue to push the frontier by allowing millions to vote every year on how to allocate portions of the state budget. With partners like the International Budget Partnership and the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, we're eager to help governments achieve open budget reforms and reap the full rewards that open budget system bring to countries and their citizens. Let me close by again thanking our distinguished panel, and I'm particularly pleased to see the finance minister from Afghanistan. I had the opportunity to visit Afghanistan in May and see how our team, despite all the challenges on the ground, is working very closely with government counterparts to push ahead on the challenges, and hear firsthand from President Ghani about the way in which he sees the budget delivering services to its citizens and the importance that the budget processes have for the education system in particular, I think, which is a big concern to bring all young citizens into the education system. And of course, very pleased to meet the minister from Georgia, where I think we have very good examples and a good peer learning exercise already going on between experiences in Georgia and other countries. So I'm very interested in hearing both of your experiences as we hear the panel. But with that, let me thank our partners from the International Budget Project and Oxfam America, and all of you for bringing the energy and commitment to this agenda. And we will work happily and gladly with all of you advance this agenda and bring it forward. And thank you again for coming, and I look forward to hearing the panel and the exchanges of the panelists in the next few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vice President Walliser. I'd like to take a second before I pass it over to Vivek Ram Kumar, the Director of Policy at International Budget Partnership, to thank our audiences online from around the world. This event is streaming on the World Bank Live in English and Spanish. You can also follow along on Twitter with the hashtag #PoundOpenBudgetSurvey. We'll be taking questions from the audience here at the end of the discussion, and encourage those watching on the World Bank Live to submit your questions online or via Twitter by using the hashtag. And by all means, tweet about the important comments, issues, and themes we're discussing today. So without further ado, then, to speak a little bit to the survey's findings, let me welcome Vivek.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. As was mentioned, my name is Vivek Ram Kumar, and I'm Senior Director of Policy at the International Budget Partnership. I have been advocating for transparency in government for over 17 years. But the past couple of years feels different and more challenging than any of the previous years. We seem to be at a critical juncture. Around the world, there has been an increase in public mistrust in government, in part due to instances of corruption, but also because of dramatic increases in inequality. In several countries, leaders who have attempted to disguise their intolerant and reactionary agendas with populist rhetoric have been swept into power by those who have been left behind. More broadly, across countries, there has been a shrinking of civic spaces, a rollback of media freedoms, and crackdown on those who are seeking to hold government to account, including individual activists, civil society organizations, and journalists. Because open and accountable public budgeting lies at the heart of democratic practice and equity, it is the first place we should turn to when looking for ways to strengthen the interaction between government and citizens. Ensuring that the public budgeting process is characterized by high levels of transparency, appropriate checks and balances, and opportunities for public participation is one essential key to stemming the decline in public confidence in government and representative democracy. In the face of the spread of such profound threats to informed and active public participation, and thus the ability of citizens to ensure that their governments will pursue policies that will improve their lives, the Open Budget Survey provides critical data on the state of budget transparency and accountability. More fundamentally, the survey answers two questions for representative democracy. One, are the conditions for representative democracy to function, that is the free flow of information and opportunities for public participation in government decision-making and oversight present in the budgeting sphere? And two, are independent and empowered oversight institutions providing adequate checks and balances and protecting the most vulnerable? The Open Budget Survey is the only independent and comparative measure of budget transparency and accountability in the world. The survey assesses whether national governments produce and disseminate to the public 8 key and basic budget documents during the course of the year in a timely, comprehensive, and accessible manner. The survey also assesses opportunities for public participation in budgeting and oversight practices of legislatures and supreme audit institutions. The transparency indicators in the survey are used to construct the Open Budget Index, which provide an overall score ranging from 0 to 100 and to rank every country in the survey. The 2017 survey is the 6th round of the biennial Open Budget Survey and covers 115 countries, home to approximately 93% of the world's population. There are 3 key findings from the 2017 survey that I share with you. First, there are major gaps in the overall levels of budget information that governments are making available to their citizens. The average score received by 115 countries on the 2017 Open Budget Index is only 42 out of a maximum possible score of 100. 89 countries provide insufficient levels of budget information, including 27 countries that provide scant or no information on their budgets. Overall, 40% of the budget documents assessed worldwide are not made available to citizens. These documents are either not produced, produced for the government's internal use only, not published online, or published too late to be useful. Of particular concern are 27 countries that do not even publish their executive's budget proposal, the foundational document providing details of a government's budget policies and priorities. Further, even when budget documents are published, they frequently lack sufficient information. Thus, the types of information that citizens may wish to see, such as on sector spending, budget implementation, or the goals and outcomes of spending, are missing in many government budgets. Analysis undertaken by the IBP on OBI results reveal that countries with higher income, freer press, and more democratic traditions tend to have higher OBI scores and are perceived to be less corrupt, while oil-dependent autocracies tend to have lower OBI scores. Nevertheless, some oil-dependent countries like Mexico and relatively low-income countries like Guatemala and Jordan provide sufficient levels of budget information. This finding shows that any government that has political will can achieve its desired levels of budget transparency. A second key and likely most troubling finding from our survey is that overall progress towards budget transparency has stalled for the first time since we began measuring it. The average score received by 102 countries that were assessed in 2015 and 2017 has declined by 2 points. And there's been a particularly steep reversal of previous gains achieved in sub-Saharan Africa. Of the 27 sub-Saharan African countries assessed in 2015 and 2017, 22 countries have seen their scores fall, including 15 countries whose scores have fallen by more than 5 points. There does not appear to be any overall trend explaining the regression in budget transparency. Although we've not yet undertaken an in-depth examination, a preliminary look using simple correlations around the changes in OBI scores show that they are not strongly correlated with changes in democracy indices, income levels, oil dependency, or human development outcomes. Our assessment indicates that the fall in budget transparency cannot be attributed to any single phenomena or to any deliberate attempt on the part of all these governments to withhold information from citizens. There is, however, one silver lining in the otherwise discouraging news on the fall in budget transparency. Countries still provide more budget information now than they did 10 years ago. The average score received by 77 countries for whom comparable data is available has increased by 6 points over the past decade. And some countries have achieved impressive gains in budget transparency over the past 2 years, including Georgia, Mexico, Afghanistan, Senegal, and Jordan. A third finding from our survey is that lack of budget transparency is compounded by few opportunities for public participation in budgeting and the existence of weak and ineffective budget oversight institutions. The 2017 survey shows that few governments offer any meaningful opportunities to their citizens to participate in the formal budgeting process. The average score received by 115 countries on indicators of public participation in the 2017 survey is only 12 out of a maximum possible score of 100. There are, however, some innovations being advanced in the field. For example, the Philippines uses budget partnership agreements to provide formal authority to civil society organizations to attend meetings in which the budgets of individual agencies are formulated. In some instances, these budget partnership agreements have strengthened the ability of the agencies to negotiate their budgets with the Central Budget Ministry. South Korea operates a waste reporting center that allows the public to make complaints on mismanagement of public funds. Over the past 16 years, the center has saved the government an average of more than $1 billion a year. And the Canadian government, Canadian legislature, claims to have registered more than 1 million interactions with their citizens using various platforms during last year's pre-budget consultations. While civil society budget monitoring work is important, it cannot and should not replace the role played by formal government institutions in providing comprehensive oversight. Yet over 40% of the legislatures assessed worldwide did not make a single amendment to the budgets presented to them by their executives. And more than a third of the legislatures did not review a single audit report on the budget issued by their nation's supreme audit institutions. The 2017 survey shows that legislatures tend to exercise greater oversight during the initial phase of the budget cycle than during budget implementation. As a result, executives tend to exercise greater restraint when the legislature is approving the budget, only to make changes to it subsequently when there is more limited legislative review. This can often lead to spending that is not in line with the priorities in the approved budget and generally opens the door for executive mismanagement of public funds. While the majority of supreme audit institutions have adequate levels of operational and legal independence, what is noteworthy is that countries that perform poorly on budget transparency, such as the 38 countries that don't publish audit reports, have supreme audit institutions that are less empowered than their counterparts in other countries. The design of the Open Budget Survey is based on the premise that efficient, effective, and accountable budgets rest on 3 pillars of budget transparency, public participation, and strong oversight provided by formal government institutions. The absence of any of these 3 components can weaken the entire system. Yet the survey finds that not a single country is solid across all 3 pillars, while 22 countries fail to meet the survey's standard of adequacy on any of these 3 measures. The right package of budget transparency reforms depend on the specific deficiencies in a country's budgeting system. Accordingly, the IBP publishes individual country summaries with tailored recommendations. But the survey findings also lend themselves to general recommendations for governments, civil society, and donors. Pardon me. IBP urges national governments to institute mechanisms for public participation in budgeting and to complement these measures by achieving a threshold score of more than 60 on the Open Budget Index, which will make the participation mechanisms more meaningful. A quick step for all governments to take is to publish budget documents that they already produce. The 2017 survey found that more than 20% of the budget documents assessed across the 115 countries are currently produced by governments for their internal use only or not published online in a timely fashion, and could easily be made available on existing government websites in a timely manner at minimal cost to government. Further, government should ensure that they publish budget documents consistently from one budget cycle to another. Finally, government should prioritize transparency reforms based on the specific information needs that citizens may have, such as information on sector spending, budget implementation, and the goals and outcomes of spending. Civil society organizations should continue to advocate for greater budget transparency, while simultaneously emphasizing the need for having vulnerable voices heard in budget debates. They should make maximum use of available budget information and participate in budget debates to the maximum extent possible. Further, civil society organizations should seek to broaden the constituencies demanding transparency reforms to include social movements, government champions, and private sector actors. Donors should reconsider their strategies so that they leverage their foreign assistance in ways that contributes to greater budget transparency and accountability. This can be achieved by improving donor coordination with domestic actors like civil society and government oversight bodies, by focusing not just on transparency reforms, but the sustainability of the reforms, and by supporting measures that enhance public participation in budgeting. In conclusion, let me emphasize that the 2017 Open Budget Survey finds that governments are providing less budget information now than they did 2 years ago, and are failing to create spaces for citizens to have a voice in budget decision making. If these trends continue, governments will inevitably become less accountable to their citizens. This should be of concern to everyone who is interested in reinvigorating democratic practice, re-engaging the disaffected, and reinstating public trust in government institutions. As such, the challenge before us is clear. It is now up to us to work together and use the tools at our disposal to reverse these trends. Thank you.
So I want to remind everyone that we are live streaming on World Bank Live, and we have a hashtag Open Budget Survey. Please tweet and get the word out about this incredibly important report that we've released and this discussion that we're having. Prior to moving to the panel with our distinguished panelists, we are really fortunate to have one of the leaders in finance in the world over the last 20 years, has put together a video for us. Her Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia. We're going to show her video, which is just about 4 minutes, sharing her views on where we are in terms of open budgets and the importance of the Open Budget Survey. So if we can have that.
I am Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance from Indonesia. Today I welcome the launch of the survey on Open Budget 2017. The survey is a very valuable source of information for government, civil society, and many stakeholders. By assessing the transparency and accountability, it can provide a snapshot of the strength of institutions and practices that will hold government to account for how it manages and uses scarce public resources. I hosted this event in 2015 in the World Bank. At that time, I spoke about the importance of budget transparency and accountability for many countries in the world, especially developing countries, because the need for development is very high and unlimited, while the public resource is always limited. As a finance minister of Indonesia today, I'm also very proud to show that Indonesia is working and committed to make our budget transparent and accountable. Indonesia this year is going to have an improved score, but I think we are not going to be complacent. We need to do more because people should know how we collect money, how we use money, and how the debt is going to be made and repaid. This is important for Indonesia people. By also having a transparency, we are going to provide all stakeholders with equal and same information. This is important for our investors as well as for rating agency. By having this kind of information, we are going to have people to participate in this public debate. We are going to create a healthy debate about a choice of the policy. And this is what we call it the ultimate value of democracy. With this year's launch of the Open Budget Survey, I encourage all government, stakeholders, civil society to participate and to use the result as a lesson learned for all of us to improve our budget management. I'm proud to work together and participate with the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, as well as the International Budget Partnership. The two initiatives which is going to provide and support for all countries in the world to be able to improve transparency, to strengthen accountability, and to invite more inclusive process in their budget. I would like to congratulate the organizer and make this survey to become a milestone for all countries to improve their budget management. Thank you so much.
To the stage, please. If we could have our honorable ministers and undersecretaries sit over in these 3 seats, please. We are going to have some responses from our colleague from Mexico in Spanish, so if you have your headsets, if you don't speak Spanish, please. Minister, wait, could we move down, please? Thank you. Thank you. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to have at least 2 rounds of questions that I'll be asking, and then we'll open up to the audience as well as from our live stream. So we have the Honorable Finance Minister Mamuka Baktadze from the country of Georgia. Welcome, Your Excellency. We have the Honorable Eklil Ahmad Hakimi, the Minister of Finance of Afghanistan. The Honorable Fernando Galindo Favela, the Undersecretary of Expenses in Mexico. Mary Beth Goodman, who was the former Special Assistant to President Obama, the Director of Development and Democracy in the previous U.S. administration. Manal Fowd, the Deputy Division Chief from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And Ian Gary from Oxfam America, an incredibly distinguished panelist. So let's give them a round of applause as we begin. So let me begin with our Minister of Finance from Georgia. Georgia is one of the few countries to have moved up dramatically over the last several years, Minister, from a score of 34 in 2006 to a score of 82 in 2017. The question really is, does it become harder not only to sustain that level of budget transparency as you continue to progress, but also to make even further gains? And what are some of the plans under your leadership to continue making greater advances in Georgia?
Thank you.
Is it on? Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me express that I'm honored to be here and participate in today's event. Indeed, the Open Budget Index is a very direct and objective criteria of the government transparency general. And when we look back to the past that we have gone, we are really very proud to see the results. In 2006, Georgia was a country with a minimal transparency. And after 10 years, we are in the list of the countries with extensive transparency. And it's a very big achievement for our nation. Georgia is a small economy, therefore integration in the worldwide economy is a very big priority for our country and for our government. And we do believe that inclusive growth is the main precondition for Georgia to become a truly developed country. Therefore, Open budget index is a very important criteria for our government. Well, of course, I mean, we do believe that there is a big room to improve also our procedures. For example, in terms of public participation, we scored 22. But if you look at the global average, which is 12, we are not doing so bad, but we do believe that there is a big room to improve our position, and we have the specific plan how to do it. Another very important fact which I would like to highlight is the importance of communication with public society and with non-government organizations. The uniqueness of Open Budget Index is that it is evaluated not by government agencies but by public society and then non-government organizations. Therefore, communication, and I would say very frequent communication with all the stakeholders, is the main precondition to be successful and to reach the inclusive growth. In our understanding, accountability front of your voters is but will become the main driver of the economic growth. As I have mentioned, for countries like Georgia, it is really very important because we are a small economy and therefore we are highly dependent on foreign direct investments. And therefore, creating the sustainable growth is of vital importance for our country. And we truly believe that it's not the end. There is a big room for us to improve our procedures. Of course, the methodology is also becoming, more sophisticated, but it's also the very, very positive challenge for everybody to try to push the transparency into another level.
Thank you so much, Minister. Appreciate it. If I could go to Minister Hakimi from Afghanistan. You know, one of the remarkable things for us who watch and support budget transparency and accountability in the world is the progress that Afghanistan has been made. Despite what most people unfairly assume that in post-conflict societies such as Afghanistan, that this is not possible. Afghanistan has proven that it is possible. But now that you've proven that it is possible, how do you continue to sustain the progress and potentially even continue to improve as you move down the line?
Thank you very much. I also want to thank you and all the organizers for inviting me to represent Afghanistan here in such a distinguished session. As you rightly mentioned, Afghanistan is unique among other countries because after 40 years of war and devastation, particularly when we started after the Taliban's withdrawal, a unique reforms from a revenue collection of $130 million in 2002, and now we are managing or collecting $2.2 billion revenue. This is a major milestone, and it didn't came easily. I remember when I started in 2002 as an advisor to the Ministry of Finance, everything was manual, from a payment in Treasury to making the budget formulation, everything from A to Z. But now we have a reliable system, a very productive interactions with our donors because 53% of our budget is coming from our international partners. And also we have a very vibrant civil society that 600 civil society organizations already registered, which at least 10 of them are actively engaged with budget formulation and all the way up to budget reporting and budget auditing. So I should say that from those days up to now, we have achieved a lot. And from 8 transparency scores in 2008, we jumped to 47 in the most recent survey in 2017, which itself is an indication of reform. And we, as long as the sustainability is concerned, we have come up with a public financial management roadmap and also associated implementation arrangements for the next 5 years, which we think that will establish more transparency and in our core businesses, how to give accessibility to public and also civil society, and how they engage in from the policy level all the way to formulation of budget, planning of budget, and also execution of budget, and also, of course, reporting and auditing. We have a very good relationship with our donors. We have a unit of aid coordination within our ministry, which we interact with all our donors to provide them more information and also give them accessibility to our public financial system to see every transactions that's coming from their taxpayers all the way it's going to end users. And also with our media outlets, we have established a very good relationship. They are participating in all our budget hearings and also with the civil society and mid-year budget review, and also the at the end when we publish the budget executions. In a daily basis, we publish our revenue collection and also the budget execution through our website, and everybody has access into it. And of course, at the end, we have accessibility to all our public and also civil society. And I'm proudly say that particularly this year, we have managed to, for the first time, to have a budget based on the best international practices, a unified budget of operation and also development budget. And for the first time, we are applying this use it and lose it principle this year. And I'm sure that will not only bring more transparency and accountability, but the execution rate within our budget, which last year, particularly the development budget, was 67%. Our goal is to go over 85%. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Undersecretary Favela, Mexico has also been advancing budget transparency over the last 10, 15 years. How has that work really started to influence and advance the broader anti-corruption effort in the country, and even more broadly, the sustainable development goals, the development goals that Mexico has set for itself? And for those of you who need translation.
Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to this very important panel. Undoubtedly, transparency is essential for accountability and to improve public policies in each one of our countries. Mexico, in the last 10 years, has started a process of legal reforms that have led to strengthening of institutions and the information that must be available for society at large. There is a law that states that information is a right for the citizens, and Mexico has established a process within its development plan, the need to improve transparency, but also measure ourselves vis-a-vis the other countries. So we have a goal to improve year by year, and then we have been able to make available to the organizations all the information in an accessible and easy way. We have also improved our portal on the internet in budget transparency, where you can go in and with geo-referencing, you can see all the information on public expenditure, especially public works. And through this, people are able to know what investment projects are being developed in their own community, in their own municipality, in their own locality. And this is a preventative for corruption. With President Enrique Peña Nieto, there have been some institutional reforms to prevent corruption and to do away with corruption. So one of the most important elements is for people to know how their taxes are being put to work, how they're being spent. So Mexico has improved in this agenda. And to continue to improve, we believe there need to be three basic objectives. First, to have a solid, sound legal framework, to have a commitment by the government, and to have very good rapport and participation and engagement with the civil society. We need to have a rapprochement with the citizens to be communicating on a regular basis, have information that is easy to understand, to be open to information, not PDF documents, but everyone being able to manage the information in any kind of database. So herein lies the fact that transparency and continue to improve transparency, it helps because it benefits in the citizens and helps them have better quality of life. Thank you.
To you, hearing these amazing stories of progress and yet still work to be done. We know that when you were Director of Development and Democracy in the Obama administration, you and the President and the entire administration really felt that open budgets were a critical component of democracy. Tell us more about how open budgets link to democracy, how critical they are, and what you see as trends in terms of open budgets and democracy, building on some of the results that Vivek shared with us in his presentation.
Sure, thank you. It's unfortunate that I think we're seeing perhaps what some Freedom House and others have called a decline in democracy. Perhaps, as Vivek mentioned, a decline in some of the survey results. But it's optimistic, I think, that we have more budgets included in the survey. As the Georgia minister said, the results and the methodology are continually increasing. So we're constantly going to be getting more information to citizens. And at its heart, that's what we want in democracy. We want citizens to be able to participate in the decision-making process, to have their voice heard, to be part of the democratic governance that controls so much of their lives. And I think that we're at a moment where there is more information than ever before. There is more participation from citizens seeing that information thanks to the internet, which has expanded so globally. So at its heart, I am always an optimistic person, but at its heart, I think we're now at a moment where there is an opportunity for citizens to use this information, for civil society to use this information, for the media to report on this information in a way that we haven't had before. And at its heart, that's what we want for democracy to be successful. We want there to be more information that helps inform the decisions of the elected representatives who are governing the people. So I know it's a shocking moment in time right now, with both presidential election, Brexit, and so many other changes around the world. President Obama used to often talk about the long arc of history and how we need to take a step back and put events in the context. And I think right now we're in for a bit of a shock. That shock will probably continue for a little bit longer. But ultimately, I hope that what we're seeing now is citizens waking up and realizing that democracy is not a spectator sport, that we need to have people actively engaged for democracy to thrive and for democracy to continue to be sort of the bedrock of stability that we've grown accustomed to seeing in the world.
Thank you so much. Manal, if I could turn to you. The new open budget survey results point to poor transparency practices on the expenditure and revenue sides. What's been the IMF's experience in promoting fiscal and especially tax transparency around the world? And linking that to issues of inequality and sustainable development more broadly.
Thank you, Sanjeev. First, let me say that I'm very happy to be here. The IMF is a lead steward in the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, and we've been working closely with IBP and other partners and are fully committed to the transparency agenda. So let me start with fiscal transparency and what we've been doing. I think the IMF has been at the forefront of the transparency agenda. We first introduced the Code for Good Practices in Fiscal Transparency in 1998 and started to do voluntary assessments of transparency and fiscal practices in our country members. It used to be called ROSC. Some people might remember this. This code has been revamped several times, and since 2015 we've launched a new fiscal transparency code and a fiscal transparency evaluation tool which replaces the ROSCs. This code was adopted after public consultation, a process where key stakeholders and civil society organizations have contributed to this code. And since then, we have done 22 fiscal transparency evaluations, and 19 of them were published. The code, maybe I should say, has a slightly different focus to the open budget survey. They're good complements. The fiscal transparency evaluation digs more deeply into certain areas like fiscal reporting, forecasting, fiscal risk analysis, and management of natural resources. And it looks at outputs and their contents. We use a lot also the open budget index to inform our country examples or country evaluations. As I mentioned, it's a voluntary exercise and countries request. Actually, we have done one in Georgia, and my colleagues are traveling today to Mexico to do one in Mexico. Mm-hmm. We have surveyed countries to seek their feedback, and what they say that they found useful is that the evaluation allowed them to compare their practices to other countries and identify areas of strength and weaknesses and develop reform agendas. And I think this is very important at this stage with the conclusions that, or the findings of this 2017 survey, that we need to work more on certain priorities, and I think this will fit nicely together. The other thing is that they said that the fiscal transparency evaluations actually provided them with new information that was not available to policymakers, and I think this also suggests that some governments themselves may grapple with data requirements to shape their fiscal policy. On the tax-related transparency issues, well, of course, this is part of fiscal transparency, and recent events like the financial crisis, but also the Luxembourg and Panama leaks have all created a public debate about transparency of tax services and their role. So more and more taxpayers demand transparency there. So we do a lot of technical assistance in the areas of tax policy and tax and customs administrations in countries, and these have always covered directly or indirectly issues related to transparency. Obviously, disclosure of tax expenditures, for instance, is key, and we've helped a few countries, most recently Benin and Rwanda, to produce tax expenditure reports. But also this technical assistance cover issues related to governance and accountability in the customs and tax administrations. For instance, how to establish audit functions, to ensure that the systems and processes are working correctly, and how to report on the activities of these customs and tax administrations. Just briefly, I think we've recently increased our work in this area with other partners. So with the UN, the OECD, and the World Bank, we've established a platform for collaboration on tax, which basically is a forum for discussion on tax matters and cross-border tax issues and support of capacity building in countries. We have also other initiatives that collect and disseminate data on tax and customs administration. We have diagnostic tools such as TADAT that look at also accountability of tax administrations. Just briefly on inequalities, as you know, since 2015, the fund has committed to intensify its policy and analytical work on inclusion. We have launched on a pilot basis an initiative to look at inequality issues and how to integrate distributional issues into IMF surveillance and program work. The approach was tested in about 30 countries. Other countries are on the way, and there is active sort of support for teams to address these issues that were not necessarily bread and butter of the IMF,
right.
But so there's training, etc., and the plan is to mainstream these initiatives into the regular surveillance work of the IMF. We also do analytical work. The latest fiscal monitor was devoted to issues of inequalities and how to use fiscal policy to reduce inequalities, and also looked at universal basic income. So I think I'll stop there. But
it's really remarkable to hear not only the reinforcement work on the IMF code and obviously the assessments, but the new directions around tax and working on inequality, equality issues, inclusion issues. It's really quite a remarkable progress, and we're grateful to the IMF and Madame Lagarde for taking that leadership role. And if we can carry the conversation about inequality on, Oxfam has been one of the leading organizations in the world pushing for, advocating for increased equality around the world. Why are open budgets so critical to increasing equality? And inversely, why do opaque budgets lead to greater inequality?
Well, thanks, Sanjeev. And I want to congratulate Warren, Vivek, Claire, and the whole IBP team for putting together such a fantastic report. And also, it's very gratifying to see governments starting to incorporate the indicators and their goals vis-a-vis the open budget survey into their plans. So big congratulations there. Oxfam is very excited to be co-hosting this event. And as you mentioned, Oxfam has a global campaign on inequality called Even It Up, and central to that campaign is looking at fiscal inequalities and how to address them. Now, it's difficult to believe that a government with a closed budgeting system with very little participation is a ripe environment for addressing inequality. On the other hand, I don't think it's axiomatic that open budgeting will lead to drops in inequality. So it'll be interesting to try to unpack that relationship. But just in terms of the stark figures of inequality, last week Oxfam issued its report around the Davos meeting, and that report found that 82% of the wealth generated last year went to the richest 1% of the population. And 3.7 billion people who make up the poorest half of the world saw no increase in their wealth. So this is a stark, severe problem that is addressing or affecting the entire world. And we see budgets as extremely important venues in terms of the fight for inequality. Oxfam has a global program called FAIR, which is Fiscal Accountability for Inequality Reduction, where we're working in more than 40 countries across the fiscal value chain around taxes, budgets, and expenditures, and increasing citizen participation in all aspects. Last year, we also, for the first time, published a report called the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index. And I think this will be an interesting companion as we go over time with the open budget survey. So since it was the first year last year, we don't have any longitudinal information, but going forward, it'd be interesting to see how, if any, there is any correlation between the indicators in that survey and the open budget survey. But I would just note, for example, that while Mexico scored very high on the Open Budget Survey, it scored number 68 in the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, which looks at social spending, the tax policies in the country, as well as labor standards and labor rights issues. So it'd be interesting to talk about the connections between the two. That being said, I think there's strong evidence that increased social spending will lead to decreases in inequality. Research by Nora Lustig and others have demonstrated that quite strongly. So we do see that there's a strong connection. So I see as a necessary but insufficient condition having this open budget process for fighting inequality.
Thank you so much, Ian. If I could come back to the Honorable Minister from Georgia, if you can build on this conversation. Georgia, as we spoke about and you discussed, has made these dramatic advances in budget transparency. You also spoke about still wanting to do even more on the participation side going forward. But over the past decade, has that translated, those improvements in transparency, has that translated into the inclusive growth and greater equality, positive outcomes for ordinary citizens in Georgia? Can you share perhaps some examples or some evidence of how this amazing progress has really made a difference in people's lives?
Thank you for this question. We are facing two biggest challenges in our economy. The first is reduction of poverty, and second one is unemployment, which is, of course, they are correlated with each other. As I have mentioned, Georgia is a small economy, and we are located in a very interesting part of the world. And Georgia serves as the gateway for 8 so-called landlocked countries. And the strategy of Georgia is to become finance, logistical, and tourism hub for the region. We do believe that this strategy will support us to overcome the challenges I have mentioned. Therefore, our policy is focusing to create progresses in this direction. So we are number 9 in the world in terms of easiness of doing business. In terms of tax burden, we are also number 9 in the world. And this policy actually helped us to decrease the poverty by 10% in the last years. So we do believe that the inclusive growth is directly related to transparency and to participation of the society in crafting the policy. And as I have mentioned, we are pretty successful on our path. So in the last 4 years, the GDP growth of Georgia was much higher in comparison with our neighbors. According to IMF forecast, we will be also the leader in terms of GDP growth for the next 3 years in the region, and the region consists of 31 countries. So we do believe that this is a right policy for us to reach our goals. But indeed, we truly believe also that we should improve the components which I mentioned before, like participation more participation of society in budget creating process, and all the things that I have mentioned, they are related to each other. And if you are successful in crafting these small pieces, you can get a very good overall picture and create a very good fundament for the further economic growth of the country. So we are not looking for some general figures in terms of growth. We are looking for inclusive growth This is very important. Without inclusive growth, yes, you can have a growth of your GDP, but that may not reduce your poverty.
Benefit the entire
Yes.
population.
So inclusive growth is our aim, and therefore participation of civil society, being transparent as much as possible, are the best preconditions to achieve these goals.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I can go to the Honorable Minister from Afghanistan, can you speak to also some of the issues and themes that we've been discussing with the other panelists, how the budget transparency and accountability reforms in Afghanistan have started to empower people to improve their own lives, reduce corruption, and hopefully increase equality across the country? What are some of the positive benefits that are emerging from the reforms you've made, and how do those benefits not only get reinforced but strengthened over time?
Yeah, that was part of the new government policy, how to decentralize the financial system, meaning delegate more authority to the subnational level, and also from central departments to provincial and sub-national units, how to engage them in all planning all the way to execution of budget. So that helped a lot, and it's working very well. At the meantime, we have established a new Procurement Authority that's chaired by President and all other key ministers, that all the public financial system, but particularly providing service delivery to the public, should be very open, transparent, and more importantly, corrupt-free system. Because most of our expenditure goes to our security ministries, but providing them adequate resources through an open and transparent procurement processes were crucial. So there we have classified all the companies and also providing them equal opportunities to get access to procurement services, and at the end provide quality services, and then publish all the contracts that we have awarded them, that everybody understand what has been given to them. So at the meantime, we have come up with a anti-corruption strategy, which has mainly 5 pillars in a public sector, in financial sector, security sector, and also judiciary system. How to reduce corruption in a way that people could realize and they judge based on the indicators that we have already established. So giving more accessibility to public and also civil society to all the information that they need, from policy level all the way to execution level, that also help. So we are not there yet 100%, but the initiative already taken that we give them full accessibility, and reaching out to people, because still we have issues of technology across the country, even though we have already established infrastructure for fiber optics, but giving them all the information that they need, that's part of the policy. But ultimately engaging them in budget hearing initially, all the way to give them chance to come and complain about mismanagement of their fund or their money. It's something that we are working to make sure that they not only understand how the budget system is working, but also giving them the chance to hear them and they see that they have something to say about budget formulation and also budget planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I can come back to you, Undersecretary Favela, Tell us more about public participation in the budget process in Mexico. What has the government been doing? What are plans to move public participation forward? How does it increase trust in government in Mexico to have these participatory mechanisms?
Yes, of course, with pleasure. The government, as I said, has implemented important reforms to improve transparency and, above all, to have greater trust from society. Mexico has followed a process of fiscal consolidation. We had a significant reduction in oil production. We've followed a process, and we've had an oil price reduction, which has led to a consolidation of public expenditure because of a significant reduction in order to achieve our fiscal goals. Transparency and accountability has helped us significantly improve the quality of the public expenditure, since we had to make a very important adjustment in our budget. We were able, thanks to transparency and the public debate on public expenditure, we were able to make the necessary adjustments in the right places, in reduction of expenditures, government operations, and investment projects that really did not have the highest profitability for society. And that has helped us improve the efficiency of public expenditure considerably. That's why we consider that transparency and accountability might not be a sufficient condition to reduce inequalities, but would definitely help us make better decisions on public policies in order to improve the living conditions of society. In Mexico, despite the adjustments of recent years, we've had to focus public expenditure better in order to reduce close to 3 million the people of in extreme poverty. So it can be done despite having less resources. We can focus the things better and do it better in order to have the national debate on how the public funds are being used. What has the government done to improve that public expenditure? Well, the government has had documents with what could be called citizen language. The budget project sent to Congress and the House of Representatives every year is also published, and it's a citizen's budget so that the people can understand in a very simple way where we're planning to invest or place the money the next fiscal year. And once this document or the document is published, once it's authorized in the House of Representatives, the citizen budget is published in a very simple language so that we can report to Congress quarterly. And once we deliver the final expenditure report to the House of Representatives, we issue another document in a citizen's language so that the people know exactly where the money was programmed. And all this information is published on the transparency webpage of the Finance Ministry in Mexico. In that way, they can follow up in a georeferential manner what is being done with all the funds. In this way, with all these measures, we've been able to achieve the fiscal goals which have been fundamental for Mexico in view of the decrease in oil revenues, which has affected the budgetary process.
Live streaming on World Bank Live. For those who are online, please do send us your questions, also by the tweet, Open Budget Survey. We're going to be opening up for questions to all of you in the audience, as well as I'll provide some of the questions that we're getting from the online participants. But before I do, I want to give our other participants a set of other questions. And frankly, I would welcome Mary Beth and Mama and Ian, if you have reflections on what our government officials have been saying, by all means, jump in there. Mary Beth, I actually was going to ask you, there's a question that on using emerging technology. And you sort of brought it up a little bit in your opening. And so the question really asks is, how can emerging technologies increase public fiscal transparency, but also contribute to deepening, strengthening, re-strengthening democracy at the same time?
It's a great question, and I will not pretend to have all of the answers. But I mean, I think we don't yet know all of the ways we're going to be able to use some of the new and emerging technologies to have a greater impact on transparency and accountability for certain, but also ways that we're going to be able to use it to maybe fight corruption and give more citizens a voice in different ways to have interactions with their government. I mean, there's been some really exciting developments in the anti-corruption movement of late, where we're starting to see, you know, now that more access is available to different types of information, we're starting to see just more ability to kind of use some of that technology to find more graft in the system, right? Yeah. To find more just holes and gaps that should be plugged and are now going to be able to be sort of more effective. You know, I used to be involved with an organization called The Century, which is an effort to try and look at all of the kleptocratic efforts in certain countries in Africa and how that's contributing to human rights violations. I think we're able to combine different streams of information now because of the emerging technologies in a way that allows us to have a greater impact overall. And I think, you know, the sky's the limit. I mean, this is what I'm so excited about with some of the young millennial generation, if you will, is that, again, they're waking up and sort of seeing, you know, democracy and that they need to be an active player in that, but they're also bringing these new skills and these new ideas. And I have to rely on my niece and my, you know, my other younger folks around me to teach me about technology constantly, as I think everyone sort of does once you reach a certain age. But it is just so empowering, and it's why it's so exciting to hear that Afghanistan is, you know, making fiber optics available, and we're starting to have distance learning and things happening in parts of Afghanistan where they are, you know, in these remote areas, but able to connect to the world and take advantage of TED Talks and, you know, the Khan Academy and all these different types of things to further their education and their connection to the world. So I think the sky's the limit, and we're really just starting to scratch the surface.
Thank you so much. If I could go to our colleague from the IMF, going back to the open budget survey, were there any surprises for the IMF in reading the survey, whether it be the general sort of seemingly leveling off or slight regression, one might say, or maybe even more than slight regression, particularly in some regions of the world? And are there some implications for the survey in terms of what the IMF may want to do going forward? Either reinforce even more certain areas you're working on, or perhaps move into some other areas that you see from the survey that might need greater work?
So I don't know if I was surprised, but definitely it's disappointing. And also what I thought is the results are quite disconcerting by the scale and the spread of the reversals. So there are some explanations that the report provides. One of them is the slight change in the methodology. There's also the issue of sustainability of reforms in the transparency area and keeping the momentum, which has apparently not happened. And maybe I'll get back to this because this is an area where, you know, we do technical assistance on building institutions, so this is an area where we could perhaps work on. The other thing that might be that there's been a lack of ownership by government, so you know, they see it as a box-ticking exercise without really changing fundamentally the institutions. It could also be a capacity problem. So. You know, I don't know if it's surprising, but yeah, it's a bit disappointing. And I think what Vivek was saying earlier about the growing distrust in government in recent years due to exclusion and corruption, I think this OBS findings seem to confirm that the discontent is justified and that many governments are failing in their transparency test towards their citizen transparency and accountability. But like Mary Beth, I also want to take a more positive note, and I think that the picture is mixed. There are some outliers. Senegal has done very well in Africa. There are also new countries who have participated for the first time, like Cote d'Ivoire and Madagascar. And it's also encouraging that budgets are still more transparent today than 10 years ago. And I think the results of this survey, I'm hoping, will push countries forward. And I think, taking the longer view, the trend is upwards. And we should all work together with IBP to understand the fundamental reasons of this setback and also how to reverse the trends. As I mentioned, in terms of how it could impact our work, I think OBI informs pretty much a lot of our work. So, it will help us prioritize areas where countries need institution building on the tax side as well as on the budget preparation and reporting sides. We also have a couple of ongoing work I mentioned earlier on inequalities, on corruption. Also, that we're issuing guidance on how to tackle corruption issues. As also Marianne mentioned, we're working also on digitalization and how. So I think all these are new areas that can support going forward increased transparency.
Thank you so much, Madam. Ian, let me come back to civil society. Vivek mentioned, we all know around the world there's been this crackdown on civil society engagement. A lot of us believe, obviously, that in many ways the supply side of transparency has got better over time, but it's really the demand side that is the ultimate driver of increased transparency, participation, and then downstream accountability to results. With this crackdown, it's very hard for citizens and civil society organizations to actually create that effective demand. What's Oxfam seeing around the world in terms of this situation? How do we change this and reverse this trend of really disabling environments for citizen involvement and demand for transparency, participation, and accountability?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most fundamental questions that we're facing today, and this is an existential threat to the entire community of organizations, whether they're civil society, international financial institutions, or governments themselves, in terms of the agenda of increasing fiscal accountability. And we're seeing not only in some of the developing countries that we may be focused on, but in a place like the US where there are worrying trends, including laws that are being proposed in many states that would criminalize protests that are clearly anti-constitutional, attacks on the media, attacks even on the idea of science or the use of evidence in public policy making. So just want to make the point that it's a problem here
everywhere,
as well as
absolutely,
in the places where the survey is focused. That said, I think this is a central issue that Oxfam is looking at within our FAIR program that I mentioned. We've conducted a number of different case studies looking at how fiscal transparency and accountability work can be advanced in spaces where civic freedoms are declining or where they're closed. And I think there are a number of points that I'd want to make related to the role of international NGOs and how local NGOs should adapt their work in these kinds of changing contexts. The first point I wanted to make is in terms of international NGOs increasing their focus on donors and the international financial institutions to ensure that they're using the leverage that they do have, especially at key political moments, to advance transparency. So to give a good and live example, right now the oil-rich countries in Central Africa in the CIMAC region are facing a fiscal crisis because of the collapse of oil revenues. The IMF has said that they want to shore up CIMAC as well as the countries and start IMF programs in countries in that region. Programs have been agreed with Cameroon and Gabon. But if you look at those programs and the kinds of benchmarks and conditionalities, I really don't see that they've used that as an opportunity to increase transparency, especially to increase transparency around the oil sector, which is the lifeblood of those countries. We're looking at Equatorial Guinea and now Republic of Congo possibly getting IMF programs. So if you don't have things like contract transparency around oil revenues in those countries, and the IMF is not using its leverage, then they're really missing something. So one role for international NGOs is to really pressure the donors to play that important role. A second issue I think I'd want to underline is the recommendation that Vivek said at the outset, which is civil society groups need to have better alliances and make themselves more relevant to social movements and citizens at large. So it's very easy for a government to look at the organizations that may be one or two in the entire country who have any fiscal understanding and technical capacity to look at budgets, to look at corruption, to look at illicit financial flows and pick off those organizations. Yeah. If they're not engaged and seen as tied to social movements, then bad things can happen. But if they are, really good things can happen. So for example, in Ghana, there was a campaign called Oil for Agriculture, which was a collaboration between technically oriented and policy-focused NGOs in the capital with the Peasant Farmers Association. So one, you get better policy impacts from the recommendations that technically oriented civil society groups are making. Two, you get more sustainability because they're owned by the citizens at large. And three, if there are threats or attacks, those organizations feel like they have a group of friends. So I think that's a key issue to look at. Finally, I think looking at both the formal and informal opportunities. So informal opportunities meaning where people have friendships or other types of relationships with different technocrats or civil servants. So it's not just we create a space and civil society comes in, but there are all types of ways that we've seen change happen, and including the ways that civil society groups use technical credibility as social capital to engage with bureaucrats and technocrats to get things done, even in closed spaces. So I think that's an important lesson. I think the final point I'd want to put on the table that I think would be very interesting to discuss is that there was a point in the report which said that, quote, measures we use may overestimate the quality of formal participation and undervalue informal mechanisms. That was buried in the report, and I say that to demonstrate that I read the report before the panel.
As did everyone.
As did everyone, I'm sure. But I think it's a key point. And looking at going forward, whether governments might try to, quote unquote, game the open budget survey so that they're improving their formal participation scores. But I think we really have to look at the interplay between formal and informal and sources of power for civil society and citizens. So if the government creates, say, a quarterly meeting for civil society with the Ministry of Finance, but makes it illegal for street protests to protest corruption or waste, then I think you're creating a Potemkin village of participation, and that's something we want to avoid.
That's right. We want self-reinforcing mechanisms that support one another. Great. We're going to move open to the open questions now. And so if you could raise your hands, and then I will recognize you. We'll take 2 or 3 questions, and I'll take some from online as well. So please raise your hands. Over here in the front row, please. Yes, please. And if you could introduce yourself. There's a microphone back here, over there. Is that the one microphone we have over here in the back here? Or we could pass out a handheld here, Claire? Okay. If you could. Thank you so much. If you can introduce yourself. Can I get some other hands, please? Don't be bashful. Okay, thank you. All right.
Uganda Debt Network from Uganda.
Can you stand up, my dear?
Okay, I'm Namagai Melda from Uganda Debt Network and from Uganda. I'd want to talk about that shrinking CSO space in our country. We've noticed, as the Oxfam representative mentioned, in Uganda, a number of laws have been enacted recently that have seen CSO space shrink. We have the Public Order Management Law Act. We also have the NGO Act of 2016, which was brought about just during the 2016 presidential elections. And what this does is that, for instance, the NGO Act requires all NGOs to register and of course, renew their licenses every year. And this has been a threat to CSO operations. And of course, government has used this law to try to threaten closing some CSOs. Recently, we saw Action Aid office closed and their accounts frozen. And this is really a threat. NGOs are fearing to engage in some of the operations that are seen to be contrary to the government. Then we've also seen a decline in some reforms like migration from output-oriented budgeting to performance-based budgeting by Ministry of Finance. This kind of reform has seen a change in the kind of information being presented, like the pre-budget statement. Right now, we see information is more aggregated compared to before. It's very hard to know where exactly money is being allocated and spent, which we thought should be improved. However, we have a number of opportunities where citizen participation can be strengthened, which need to be strengthened a bit. We have the sector working groups. Currently, most of them are not very functional. They just need to be revived. We also have public fora like the national budget workshops. Though they appear to be national, but invitation is strictly by invitation. So what we want is to make sure government at least gives CSOs and the public opportunities to be able to determine the agenda and also to be able to influence the outcomes of the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had a question over here, Juan Pablo. If we could pass the microphone over, I can get it. Thank you.
Juan Pablo Guerrero, Network Director of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency. Looking at the success cases, there is always the question about how to sustain this. And we have seen in many cases that scores go up and down. As a matter of fact, very few countries since the beginning have experienced a continuous upwards trend in their efforts. So the question for you is, now that you are there, what are you doing? Or what could you recommend to do to make sure that in the next round we will see sustainability and not just scores going down?
So how can we institutionalize these gains and sustain them? I think we had a question from the gentle lady right there. There's a microphone right behind you if you stand up, or they could pass it to you. Please introduce yourself as well. All right, I'll get over here, then I'll come over there. Okay, go ahead, my friend. Please stand up.
My name is George Osei Bimpe. The question goes to the Minister of Finance from Georgia. Given the improvement that you have made, how less or more has the central government interfered in the management of the human resource of the ministry in terms of nurturing champions who lead the openness effort? My case, change in government results in changes in officials of the ministry, and so efforts are not sustained. How different is that from yours?
Okay, and we'll take one more. I think it's over here, right there. Yes.
Hello. Excuse me. I'm Nana Sajaya from the Voice of America Georgian Service. My question would be more to the authors of the report. If you could elaborate more on the difference between extensive and substantial groups. And I ask this question because I see Russia in the latter list. And it's been said a lot about how human rights and freedom of the press or corruption level is correlated with the open budget. And by every international ranking, be it by Human Rights Watch, World Freedom House, or Reporters Without Borders, Russia is one of the most oppressive regimes with the kleptocracy in power. So how does that correlate to this report? Thank you.
Right, great questions. So I'm going to come back to our panelists. If I could start with our minister from Georgia. You had a specific question about institutionalization, and I think what our colleague from Ghana was asking is, what often happens with changes in administrations is that officials, bureaucrats, civil servants get shifted as well, and therefore the reformers get moved out, and then the improvements backslide. Is the Georgian government, are you doing anything to try to institutionalize that in terms of the culture of the civil service and in terms of reform efforts there?
Thank you for these questions. Of course, sometimes reaching the target is much easier than to make it more sustainable. So yes, we do consider this as a very positive challenge. During my previous speech, I mentioned about our country strategy. about making Georgia as a financial, logistical, and tourism hub for the region. And of course, public finance management reform is a part of this big picture. I would like to answer this question with a very clear fact. So here in this audience, two my deputies are presented who have been working on this topic for the last 5 years. So this, I think that this is a very good example how government can address the factor of sustainability. Because all the efforts that government do should be oriented on creating a sustainable wealth for the nation. Therefore, only reaching some result is not the number one priority for us. Number one priority for us is to make all this sustainable. And of course, the people who are involved in the reform, who are leading the reforms, their participation on a long-term basis on this path to the result is an absolute precondition to become successful. So generally, yes, I mean, I can agree to some extent that sometimes we see that when government is achieving some result the next year or in 2 or 3 years, we see some declining. And believe me, it's not an easy process to create this sustainability. But we do believe that with such approaches that I have mentioned, it's absolutely doable. And of course, increasing the bar for the coming years is also the very important step to create this atmosphere of sustainability, to have the new challenge for the team, to have the new goal to reach. And that was the reason also why I have mentioned that on a public participation side, we still have a big room to improve our procedures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The broader question, if I could pass it over to our minister from Afghanistan, that Juan Pablo Guerrero asked from the GIFT, the Global Initiative on Fiscal Transparency, is how to institutionalize these reforms. What is Afghanistan? You spoke a little bit about this, but are there legal mechanisms? Are there institutional mechanisms? What other ways is your government trying to implement to institutionalize these reforms so they sustain over the medium, if not longer term?
One of the policy we have already developed is self-reliance, because most of our more than 53% of our budget, we rely on our partners, which we are grateful from all of them. They have been supporting us very generously for the last 15 years, particularly United States taxpayer. We are grateful from their contribution as a critical and main donor. They have helped us a lot. But according to the self-reliance policy, we have had the first time our budget based on international best practices, as I said before. And for that, we have already provided a legal framework, which is our budget bills that every year comes with it. And there we have already have some provisions for civil society and media outlets, how to engage in public hearing all the way until the reporting. So that itself is an indication that there's absolutely political will to have this commitment of transparency, and also based on mutual accountability framework, which we have already adopted with our donors. We have that commitment that which is a benchmark that we will give our donors and also our public more accessibility to our financial institutions. And that became a tradition now to share more information and also engage our public, but also our donor. And more importantly, within this new budget cycle, that became part of the law, the information sharing. So not only, as I said before, in a daily basis, we should inform our public through website and other means that our budget execution rate and also our revenue collection and also the resources that we have been receiving, not only from financial resources, but also from our donors. But one thing that we have learned that on budget support that we receive from our donors, there from our end we are sharing more information with our public. Yeah. But based on that principle of mutual accountability, off budget support that we have been receiving, there are some ambiguities. Yeah. As far as the information to the public and also to us as a client, to our donors. So this is the lessons that we have learned in order to institutionalize your system, and particularly in a country that we are more recipient of the support from our partners. So on budget support, not only providing us more resources to channel those resources based on our priorities, but also enable us to drive reform and also to build the institutions as such to deliver services. And because of that, we are grateful again from our donors that they have supported us, and we have an agreement with them that it started from 40% and now it's reached to 60%. That most of the resources that we are receiving from our partners should channel through the national budget, and it should be on budget, while the 80% of their resources should be based on the priority of our government. So I think for institutionalizations of this system, the more you rely on your own resources, the more you're committed to institutionalize it.
Thank you so much. Undersecretary, please. And if I'm going to take one more question from the audience. So yes, I'll go over here, and then I have Mary Beth after the undersecretary. Please.
Un poco contestando
Also, to answer Juan Pablo's question, I think you require three conditions. You require three conditions to maintain results in the countries. First of all, to have a sound legal framework where the laws ensure and protect budgetary transparency. This is basic. Secondly, to have an ongoing measurement and include in the planning mechanisms of each one of the countries a goal to continue to grow in the transparency index, in the budget transparency index. And a third condition, in my view, is to have continuous communication with the civil society organizations and agencies so that they make sure that they encourage the government to continue to present all the information in a transparent and exhaustive way for everyone. And these are the three conditions that are required to maintain results both in the medium and the long term.
Go over there. Okay.
I mean, I'm thrilled to hear the answers from our esteemed ministers here, because I think if you don't have that leadership at the top setting the standard, it's hard for people who are working throughout the government to know the direction they're going. So it's phenomenal to see the leadership that's being expressed here. If I were to sort of try and create a recipe for institutionalization and sustainability of some of these efforts, such as the Open Budget Survey, you know, as the minister from Georgia alluded, no one is accountable unless someone is accountable. So having people whose job and whose mandate it is to continually be charged with making progress, as he has anointed his two deputies to do, is absolutely essential. But you also have to have an effort to sort of educate others and sort of cross-pollinate the ideas within other government ministries, right? The whole effort for checks and balances and institutional strengthening is something that we've always tried to promote in these initiatives, and to have the ability to have others in other ministries appreciate why you're doing this work and to help you leverage that work is when you truly start seeing it be institutionalized within government. And also having a communication strategy, right? Why you're doing it, why it matters, and how others can take the information and build on it, and how CSOs can use it, and how average citizens can use it. And just simply getting the information out and publishing a report is not good enough, right? We have to be able to communicate why we're doing certain government policies and how it impacts people for them to appreciate the work that government is doing, but also to truly have it stick.
Yeah, fantastic. I have a question from the audience here, and then I'm going to ask one question from online, and we'll get final comments and wrap up.
Good morning. My name is Achan Ramlat from South Sudan, the Samahi Research. And in the course of doing this, civil society that partook in the open budget survey, and coming from a conflict country, a lot is lost in the necessity of having open transparency budgets. Often at times it is said that the focus should be more on a political solution. And therefore the lives, people forget that there are actually lives being lived in these societies. That for me and people who live in these societies, our voices matter, that social amenities should be given to us like anywhere else. So my question to the panelists is in twofold. As actors from different sectors, the focus should be on, you talk about how we should leverage the network that exists among the different stakeholders. But then in a case like South Sudan, for instance, where the emphasis has been that the government should not be supported when it comes to capacity building or any of that. Therefore, the government looks at it when I'm doing the research, the government does not see the need to provide me with the necessary information, and therefore it has a ripple effect on how much information can be provided. And again, in the end, I don't get the information that I need. So what strategies do you, as a donor, see that should be addressed to governments in environments that I come from, so that ultimately we have an open and budget transparency and accountability held accountable to them?
That's great. Thank you. And I'll just add one more, and then I'm going to go down this way, starting with you, Ian, back down the road. The question from online is really, do you see that implementing the open budget survey at the city level or subnational level can further advance the sort of movement for transparency, participation, and accountability, and particularly given that we've heard so much and we know decentralization is happening all around the world. So you could take one or both of those questions, and I'm going to ask all the panelists to be 1 minute, 1.5 minute, please.
Great. Well, I think I might combine some of the themes in my closing remarks, but looking at the issue of sustainability as well as the issue of how these questions that we've been discussing play out at the subnational level, and I think that's, it's not really within the scope of this survey, but I think there are important opportunities to apply some of the methodology of the survey at the subnational level, but also important things that we can learn about sustainability from the subnational that we might scale
up to the national.
Up to the national. I think that's an important point. So Oxfam has had a number of experiences at the subnational level, including in Ghana, working with George's organization, SIN Ghana, Friends of the Nation, and other groups, including district-level social accountability work. So one experience we had was in the district of Shama, which is near the oil-producing region of Ghana, and seeing that you can create this virtuous cycle where once transparency starts, once participation starts, citizens then become more engaged in questions about who's paying, where is the money coming from, and what we also saw was more domestic resource mobilization, more compliance with local fees and levies that the district has at its disposal. So getting back to the sustainability question, if it's on a political cycle where party comes in, party comes out, that might be more difficult. But if the people who are in charge see that, one, there might be a financial benefit, that looking at the whole value chain, not just the budget part, that you're reaping more fiscal benefits at the local level where those local authorities might have some money-raising possibilities. That's one element of sustainability that I think should be highlighted. But then also the closer connection between citizens and their government at the local level, I think, is something that we could study more closely and then try to model at the national level. And then finally, in terms of sustainability, I think for civil society organizations and citizens, inserting these questions into the electoral process. So, Mexico's having elections this year. Are the kinds of issues that we're talking about part of the agenda? In Ghana, they had elections in 2016. Oxfam supported a campaign called Citizens Decide, where fiscal transparency, corruption, and other issues were on the platform. We engaged youth, we engaged some of the most popular Ghanaian musicians to get that kind of issue into the public debate. I think that's an important strategy as well.
Thank you so much, Ian. Manal.
Thank you. Just a few comments, and if I start with the subnational level. So the IMF's counterpart is central government usually, so we don't deal directly with the subnational governments, but we like to think of the general government, which is central and subnational governments, and anything done at the subnational level also contributes to good service delivery, SDGs. So I think this is I would say it would be important to also go at the subnational level. On maybe briefly on the question on South Sudan, I think capacity is very low, and there's a lot of institution building taking place, and I think transparency should be one of the areas that will come out of this. But and I'm not very familiar with South Sudan, but I think it's a process and it's a complex issue, but it's part of the institution building. And I'll maybe end with just a comment on the sustainability and how to avoid reversals when government change, etc. I think if you look at the countries that are the top transparency countries like South Africa, New Zealand, all these countries have a very strong legal framework, public financial management legal frameworks, fiscal responsibility laws, and as the minister from Afghanistan said, this is actually key to, the rule of law should be the key driver for sustaining reform, so that when governments change, things don't change. Medium-term budget frameworks also help, because you cannot reverse policies, or so there's more accountability. So I think strong legal frameworks would be very key.
Thank you so much. I won't go to everyone unless you have something you want to burning to say, ministers, undersecretary, anything else you want to add? Well, I want to thank our entire panel. Please join me in a round of applause. I want to express gratitude to the World Bank for hosting us, and of course Oxfam and International Budget Partnership for their co-hosting, International Budget Partnership for their tremendous work on the Open Budget Survey. It is a great report. Do read it. There are recommendations that we all need to work together in advancing. So thank you all, and let's keep up the good work and even strengthen it going forward. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.